Welcome, everyone. I'm Cheryl Cage. I'm a Senior Security Partner Strategist with AWS, and I am on the Security and Compliance Partner team. Our team is led by Security Partner Strategists and Solutions Architects that come from the compliance and security background, and they're well-versed in moving regulated workloads on AWS. And then we have the big part of our program is our partners here. Today we have DuploCloud and A-LIGN with us, and we are a partner-led, partner-driven program. So we have vetted all of these security and compliance partners that can accelerate and automate that compliance on AWS. And today we are going to be talking about streamlining and accelerating compliance for SOC 2. So I wanted to turn it over to our two partners here that we have. And we'll start off with A-LIGN, with Scott and Connor. Can you tell us a little bit about A-LIGN?
Yeah, absolutely. So A-LIGN, we focus in and around readiness services. So predominantly professional services in and around SOC 2 compliance. We also support other compliance frameworks. So as you mentioned, PCI DSS, high trust, so on and so forth. Our team has basically been, built out these service lines in and around the space. Predominantly, for our conversation today, we'll be talking a bit about, SOC 2, which is where we're one of the largest issuers of SOC 2 reports in the world.
I'm going to turn it over to Venkat here from DuploCloud.
We are a DevSecOps as a software company. The general idea is that you would use the DuploCloud software, install it in your cloud account, and give rather high-level specifications, and the software automatically takes care of implementing the lot of lower-level details. So while it does a lot of automation, I would say automation is one part. Out-of-box security and compliance is the core reason why people buy it. About 70-80% of our customers buy us for compliance. So, and then we have done about 24 compliance certifications for our customers, and very excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you here. And we're happy to have you show everyone, the great things that you're doing around security, automation, and acceleration. Some of the things that we're going to cover today, we're going to cover, SOC 2, what is it? What is the process? We're going to talk about that SOC 2 journey, how automation plays a part in that. We also want to go into continuous monitoring, continuous compliance. How does that help with the process? And then we want to go over some risks and pitfalls, for customers to avoid as they're going through. What I want to start off with is, for A-LIGN here, if you can explain, what is SOC 2, why do I need it? And then, what is that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as SOC 2 goes, we can start with the basics. So as far as the definition goes, SOC or SOC stands for Systems and Organization Controls. It's basically a security audit that is issued or performed by a CPA firm like A-LIGN. And basically what we do is we look at the people, the process, and the technology around the organization that we're auditing. So when we talk about the people, who are the key players, who's in charge of governance, and what are their roles and responsibilities within the organization. Then when we talk about processes, what are the policies, what are the procedures, what are the mechanisms in place to make sure that things are functioning appropriately. And then lastly, technology. So technology, of course, what tools, what systems is the organization using to make sure that the security posture is appropriate for the organization. As far as the process itself goes, there's a couple of different things. There's a readiness assessment, I think Scott mentioned earlier, which is essentially what the starting point for most clients. Then we sort of move to a type 1, which is the design phase of the audit, which essentially says, hey, now that we've done the readiness assessment, we've identified all these key gaps, what's the design of the overall control environment? Then once we have that established, we move to the type 2, which is kind of the final piece, if you will, in the audit cycle, which basically is now we've had the readiness assessment, we've identified what these gaps and pitfalls are, we've moved to the type 1, we've determined that there's an appropriate design of the control environment. Now we move to the type 2 and say, okay, how are these controls operating effectively over a period of time? As far as the scope of the SOC 2, there's 5 basic trust services criteria is what they're called. So the most common one is security. Then we have availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. And depending on the scope or depending on the services that the client is providing, some of those may be applicable, some of those may not, just depending on the nature of the services and of the business. So that's kind of the what of what SOC 2 is. If we talk about why it's important, I think it's really arguably the most common security compliance standard out there right now. And it definitely gives organizations that we work with a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And I also think it builds trust with your customer base as well. And you say, hey, here's our security posture. We've been audited by a third-party firm, and here are our controls. So it certainly provides that benefit for our clients in terms of a competitive advantage and just making sure that their security control environment is sound.
So one follow-up question there with
Sure.
you talked about SOC 1 or type 1 and then type 2. Can I just go to, do a type 2 assessment?
Yeah, I wish it was that easy. We typically dissuade our clients from going that route, especially if they're coming to us for the first time. And the reason being is that there's just a lot of moving pieces with the SOC 2 security. Even if you're just doing the basic security principle and not adding on any of the other 4 that I mentioned, there's still, quite a long list of controls and things that you need to work through. And so that's what I really try to coach and guide clients that come to us and say, hey, we need to start with the readiness assessment. We need to figure out what the gaps and the deficiencies are. And then from there, we can start talking about the type 1 and the type 2. So there's a lot of overlap between SOC 2 and some of those other standards. So if a client was already compliant with some of those other standards and they came to me, it might change the calculus a little bit. But for the most part, we always like to start with the readiness assessment or certainly a type 1 before moving to the type 2.
What are the main trust service criteria you see customers going through that are built on AWS?
The most common one by far is security. So security is required for every SOC 2 audit. And I would say most of our clients, or at least the ones that we work with, tend to kind of fall. Obviously, security, availability, and confidentiality are usually the other 2 most common ones that we see. Again, availability kind of being an assessment of the overall availability of the services or the systems that we're looking at. Things like uptime and that sort of thing. And then when we talk about confidentiality, really that's how does the confidential information within the organization, how is that secured and how does that data flow in and out of the organization?
And Venkat, what's the main reason or main driver when customers come to you for SOC 2 that they're saying that why they need it?
Yeah, I think you could basically say when you come to, when you have to do SOC 2, like Connor sort of mentioned, trust is one of the main principles and it's good to have all those security and also audited. But how do you sort of get there? Like, I think I would basically say that there's sort of 3 pillars, like he said, like there is people, process, and technology. Technology, you could say that I would basically say nowadays 70-80% is about cloud and cloud infrastructure, and the rest of it is about endpoint security. So the role that we play is that we would make sure that the cloud infrastructure is actually secure. So we are the implementation piece. So now what the customers generally would do is that either they can do it themselves by putting a lot of point tools in place, or they sort of come to us and say that, okay, we want an out-of-box compliance infrastructure, A, and second, this is something that we don't need to worry about. We want to focus on our application and we want to make sure that behind the scenes everything is compliant. If something is not compliant, we need to be alerted and so on. So what we do is that we not only make sure that the compliance controls are implemented, which is what we call as provisioning time controls, like encryption at rest, VPC, security groups, whatever, encryption and whatnot. And then once that is done on an ongoing basis on an operations, we tend to monitor. So that's generally why they would sort of come to us. And like there could be a vast different types of audiences. There are people who are like really small customers. They don't have any DevSecOps engineers in-house, or there may actually be larger organizations who have much larger infrastructure and they need to be compliant much faster. So that's some of the common drivers why they would talk to us and the general approach towards it.
Can either one of you discuss, the AWS shared responsibility model and how you handle that for how that factors into, SOC 2 assessments?
I think in general, AWS is a shared security model. What it basically means is that they are responsible for some part of it and that the customer is responsible for other parts of it. So what are they responsible? They're responsible for data centers. They're responsible for a lot of physical controls and things like, security groups, for example. So as long as you provision the security group, they're responsible for the implementation of it, like the VLANs, the verbs, the routers and whatnot, as long as you provision the VPCs and those things correctly. But then fundamentally, you are responsible to make sure that those controls are applied correctly. You have the right set of security groups, encryption at rest has been applied, because you could do things in both ways, right? And sometimes people do people ask, like, why do people go and open security groups, for example, or why would somebody actually not go and do encryption? Because there are a lot of technical reasons. Like, for example, if you want to run an inexpensive database, for example, really a small database, encryption may not even be supported because, I mean, it's not a production use case. So you have to really go through the nuances of it. And there is some literature about like what are the specific controls that you need to implement. I mean, there's a lot of documentation in AWS, even in our website and so forth. But that's the general principle of how you have to do it. But you have to go control by control, and the stuff which is not in your scope, I think it's called inheritance, if I'm not wrong. Like you can inherit those controls from AWS.
Yeah, I think, just, jumping into the shared responsibility model a little bit more, you really look at it from kind of the stack and who owns what. Starting at the infrastructure as a service, right? AWS actually carries their own SOC 2, and they do that for each one of their services. So they've implemented those controls. They've been able to assert that these are in place, and then it kind of starts moving up the stack up to the customer. So each one of those layers, you have different ownership and who's responsible for the controls that are in place. Many times once it gets to the customer, it may just be customer data. So they may be responsible for the encryption at rest, encryption in transit of the customer data that's moving through that environment. So it's really understanding what you own in the shared responsibility model, making sure that you have the controls that are necessary to be in place from a security best practices perspective, and then just making sure that you are able to report back and assert as a management team on what you've got in place.
Right. And in fact, like I would say that if you were to put like names, you have AWS, you have the DevOps people, which is customers in-house, and then you have the developers. So developers are responsible for the application, penetration testing and stuff like that. DevOps is responsible to configure the AWS correctly, security group, IAM role, and a whole bunch of things. And then AWS, which has its own set of things around IaaS and so forth.
Yeah, and a couple tools from AWS that can help with that too. Our SOC reports are they're on the AWS Artifact service that customers can download and see what our controls are and how they were tested. And then there's also our services and scope page that outlines all of the AWS services that have been compliant. They have gone through the testing. The other thing is, we did discuss scoping a little bit. So, how do you help your customers scope those controls? So how do you automate the controls for them? And when they come to you and say, oh, I'm going to go through the security trust service criteria, what controls do I need to have? Since SOC 2 is not prescriptive, or they don't define what the controls are. So the customer needs to define those.
Yeah. I'll start off, but I think at a high level, there are some standard best practices that you sort of put in that are applicable to the AWS level of configurations. Some of the things are very standard, like encryption, security groups, and monitoring and stuff like that, right? They're part of that. But then I think it's really that when they talk to A-LIGN and companies like A-LIGN, when they actually go and help them put in place a lot of those scoping.
Yeah, I think essentially when you think through it, it's really, if you think about it from like a security by design perspective, which is to know your requirements, build to your requirements, and then monitor them over time. If you know going in that you have to adhere to SOC 2, you're still going to look towards industry standards and guidelines, like let's say a CIS benchmark for how you configure and harden your AWS environment. And then from there, you build up, right? So it's really looking towards the industry in and around what security best practices are available, knowing your requirements, and then building to those within the environment.
Right. And I'll add to that is that in general, where we have been engaged, we try to take a high standard of security posture, wherein we try to push as many controls as possible out of the box. And then, of course, there are some cost concerns because, like, for example, let's say you want to enable guard duty, right? You might not want to enable guard duty in a dev environment and so forth. So we tend to put as many controls as possible and then provide simple knobs to push the rest of them once the scoping has been done by talking to the auditors and so forth. So the general idea is that it's automated in such a way that you can start with a good standard and then you can go up if you like, and sometimes you can also go down.
And we talked about the readiness assessment. Is that normally when you go through that scoping process, with the customer?
We like to always start with the readiness assessment, of course, like we said, but really that scoping conversation kind of starts even before we get to that point. So really once a client reaches out to us and says, hey, I'm interested in SOC 2, we want to move forward with that. that's usually the point when we have kind of what we call a timing call or a scoping call. We need to make sure that the SOC 2 framework, works for every one of those clients. And certainly there are controls that we can map for each one of those that would be applicable. And we do that. But it really just kind of starts at, when the client engages us, hey, what's your business? What are you guys doing? And how can we help from there? And then usually that kind of becomes clear from that conversation. And then from there, of course, we go, hey, readiness assessment type 1, type 2, so on and so forth.